let's start with the movie. This is from Enthusiasm from 1930, Ziga Vertov. This is to illustrate or demonstrate the well-established or known idea that religion and revolution, particularly workers or Marxist revolution, are diametrically opposed, or at least they were in the Bolshevik Revolution and most forms of communist revolution since then. It's particularly interesting, I think this shot is quite beautiful, that the steeple is destroyed and instead supplanted by the industrial smokestacks in the background. This was shot in the Ukraine during collectivization in the 1930s. And of course the idea from the Marxist point of view was that religion is coercive and hierarchical, that it could only support the czarist or bourgeois states, and that it, as Marx said, was the opium of the masses. At this point, however, to claim to be religious or Marxist is met with basically the same kind of attitude, which is that it's foolhardy because it's obviously anachronistic. It's both are disproven by either historical or scientific fact and are therefore unenlightened or ignorant, contrary to any sort of philosophical enlightenment project. It's impossible to, or it was at one point impossible to fearlessly declare that you're a Marxist or religious without seeming a little bit anti-intellectual. People assume that you have an uncritical assumption of inherited beliefs and that you're actually superstitious. Both are beautiful mythologies that don't work or haven't been really put into practice well. That situation has changed recently. I disagree that the return of religion is a myth. I think it has returned to us in us leftist intellectuals in a way that we now have to deal with it as a fact on the ground. What has changed? Well, we were in a position at the end of the 20th century where philosophical leftism had retreated basically to a liberal position, or had surrendered so much ground that we more or less accepted the idea that we had reached the end of history and there was a new world order, that US American and European domination was inevitable, that so was the ascendancy of corporations over nations, and that there was basically a triumph of capitalist parliamentarism behind a mask of what it claimed to be democracy and human rights politics, which were basically masking brutal corporate exploitation. We instead had this postmodern relativism or post-structuralism that more or less delighted in the free play of signifiers. There was no way of making positive ideological or philosophical declarations that were universally true, and instead we had what was called, or is still called, critique. There was no more way of speaking of a philosophy of truth, and there was only critique. That coincided with the collapse of state communism, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the capitalist takeover of China, basically, that Maoism doesn't work, or at least seems to not, or seems to have been abandoned by the Chinese state, and more or less they're becoming capitalist. However, since then, two things have happened. There was, September 11th, and the war on terror has supplanted the Cold War and the New World Order. The war on terrorism is, global as the Cold War was, but it's subtracted from the excitement of the Cold War. We subtract leftism, we subtract the state, and we just have radical guerrillas, both urban and third world, who we don't really agree with. And then also, more recently and more excitingly, we have the collapse of free market capitalism with this current credit crisis. We haven't really been able to deal with that, or I think its popular representation has been limited by the fact that most people don't seem to understand it, and myself included, and it underscores the fact that the capitalist economics is radically alienating and metaphysical, and we don't understand it because neither do bankers or economists. If you actually try to talk about the credit system, or especially these more meta financial products that caused the collapse, like futures and derivatives, it's opaque to most people, and that's actually why it collapsed, because there's no substance behind it. So the situation we have now is that we do have a potentially revolutionary situation. We are seeing in this emergency situation a reemergence of socialist capitalism and nationalization of institutions like banks and industries. And also, in the past few years, the most exciting philosophical projects have been directed towards a reestablishment of universal truth. And I'm thinking about Badiou and Zizek. And while they're making strong ground, while they're making strong points, I think the other thing we have to look at is what the situation on the ground is, which is that since World War II, at least, there's been a mass urbanization and a global demographic movement of the poor towards the cities. And resistance is largely religious, and secularism is actually quite bourgeois. In global terms, it would be quite alienating to speak to any third world people about the death of God, for example. And if you want to have any sort of workers' revolution or third world revolution against the first world, to do so in a completely secular framework would be futile. And indeed, that's what we've come to with the Soviet Union. I would like to posit that if the Soviet Union hadn't rejected religion from its beginnings, then we might not have had the collapse of communism as we've seen it. In the beginning of the Soviet Union, there were groups within the communists who did think that communism should work through the church, but they were rejected by Lenin, among others. I think it's generally, in the United States at least, it was generally regarded that communism collapsed in part because it contained the seeds of its own demise, basically. The inefficiency of the economic system, for one, could not bear the economic strengths of the arms race, for example, but also there's this idea that any oppressive system would eventually be overthrown by its people, which is ironic. But if you talk to Islamic jihadists, for example, they believe that they caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they consider, or they're referring specifically to the war in Afghanistan, which certainly did play a role in the end of Soviet imperialism. And I also think that the Catholicism played no small role in the demise of Soviet communism. John Paul II and his solidarity with Polish solidarity, for which he abandoned or let out to dry any sort of leftist movements within the Catholic Church in Latin America, for example. So he more or less tacitly supported fascist regimes there, and in Spain, repeating the tacit support of fascism of the Catholic Church during World War II. And now we're, of course, seeing its resurgence in Ratzinger. I'd like to play a section from one of my films called Self-Defense, which I made immediately after 9/11 in New York. And this is a short biography I made about jihadists who had fought in Afghanistan and had since immigrated to Brooklyn. And this section is his memories of fighting in Afghanistan. And I think it makes interesting contrast to what we've just seen with Vertov's enthusiasm.
While Afghan war was going on, I had a friend, older friend, used to be like my teacher, but he loved me very much. So he went and he came back. When he came back another human being, like somebody who practiced more what he was doing. And that made many people join. Most of them, they died. Even that, I look at it and said, those people, they are better than me, so I don't want them to be better than me, so I just want to go. In that time, my father didn't agree with me, but I decided already. I was 14 years old, 15. When you go there, they're very humble people. They treat you like brothers, like you don't miss your parents. So they teach you and they train you, they do whatever is needed. They give you a different common than people who treat you like you are their son. But you don't just go and fight or do whatever. They teach you the law, how to do it. God said in the Quran, when you kill in the best way. Meaning that you don't punish the person, you kill him, and that's it. We don't need to punish nobody. If they capture you, there's no time to put you in prison. There's no way to put the person. So you have two choices. You accept Islam, or you die. If you're in the war, either you die or you kill. If you don't be in there, it's very difficult for you to explain. You see somebody maybe 2 minutes before, after 2 minutes you find a dead person. So it's very sad. Most of my friends that I know, they died. Actually, the real person who was fighting, he's fighting because he want to die, he don't want to live. He's fighting because he want to become a shaheed, meaning martyr, or somebody who died for the sake of God. Yeah, 15, 16, 17, doesn't matter. So I made my own decisions. Nobody pushed me to do it. So if I die in that, that's no problem.
Aren't you afraid?
No. There is nothing to afraid. In this life, nothing. Don't fear nothing. You don't have to worry about this life that much. You don't focus on it. You die, no problem. Because some people, they love too much material things. They want everything to be what? They control everything. They don't want to die. They want to live here forever, which is impossible. every human being die. One day.
Well, one of the reasons I think it's an interesting contrast to enthusiasm is because in the same way that the collapse of the steeple is to reveal the industrial smokestacks behind is very iconographic of the Bolshevik Revolution. The collapse of the World Trade Center is an interesting mirror that would bookend the 20th century, that industrialism, now financial capitalism, has collapsed to in the name of God. I think what's interesting about Ibrahim and people like him is that because he not only doesn't fear death but actively wants to die, he is unstoppable. I mean, what we know from Hegel's dialectic, if not Marx's, is that the struggle between master and slave is won by whoever doesn't fear death. And I think that is part of our fascination with jihad, and really why it is in part inspiring. I mean, despite the horror of the innocence of the lives lost in September 11th, there was, I think at this point we can admit, a secret rush felt by leftists or revolutionaries, kind of expressed, by Stockhausen in his famous quote that it's the greatest work of art of the 20th century, or Baudrillard when he said that it was inevitable because we had all imagined it, both of which have some truth to it. Although there is, of course, no justification for such mass slaughter, I think that September 11th is different from the subsequent Al-Qaeda attacks in Madrid and London, in that in the London-Madrid attacks, it was the innocent people who were targeted, whereas on September 11th, the World Trade Center was actually an economic target, and especially when considered in the context that the Pentagon and Capitol Hill and other major American targets were also targeted. Because those destructions failed, we are left with what is apparently an act of grotesque terrorism, which it in part is, but at the same time, there was a momentary fascination, not only because of its iconographic moment of the the buildings collapsing and what they represent in terms of finance, but also because of its revolutionary potential, however perverse. I mean, of course, we don't believe in the theocratic and paleo-conservative ideology of Al-Qaeda, but at the same time, the radical agency that these men wrestled from history and the way they thrust themselves on the world stage was undeniably impressive, and so was their singularity of purpose, selflessness, and in a way, individualism. Although they sacrificed themselves to their ideology, the fact that they were very much individuals in control of their destiny has this kind of existential import, and that was what I was playing with in this film. I knew this man, and the idea behind the filmmaking was how do you make a documentary that is contrary to truth, or how do you make something that is ultra subjective? Most documentary is reportage, or kind of there's this empiricist equation of what is seen and what is to be believed, and instead, what I've been trying to do is to make a more radical subjective documentary where where we are involved in a suspension of disbelief that is normally reserved for fiction, and that suspension of disbelief is to give ourselves over to the beliefs of the subject of the documentary, and those subjects have to believe in things that are, empirically not true, and that's why I've been kind of working along the lines of religion and revolution. Religion and revolution, or miracles and revolutions, are metaphors for each other, in part because they both involve a belief so transcendent that it becomes real, and a faith against all kind of material resistance. In addition to Islamic fundamentalism, which kind of reared its head and reminded the United States and Europe of itself in 9/11 and since then, the other major religious movement of the past few decades has been Pentecostalism. I became interested in Pentecostalism because it has really given voice to the urban poor in many countries, and it is the most resurgent form of Christianity. The Pentecostalism is largely misunderstood, ignored, or maligned. Ignored because it's mostly invisible. Maligned because its major representatives are people like former vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. But it's a theology of the Holy Spirit in which practitioners believe that they are divinely inspired and that miracles happen to them in their prayer meetings. And it now boasts hundreds of millions of practitioners and is the second largest form of Christianity after Catholicism, and it's all within its brief 100-year history, and it's happening very quickly. The reason it's interesting and important is because, as I said before, secularism is more or less bourgeois, especially in the third world, and Pentecostalism has really taken hold in the urban environment and even in major American and European cities. It does have revolutionary potential, not only because of its promise of radical transformation for the individual and its participants, but also because it's rather democratic, not very hierarchical. There's decided inclusion of and participation by women especially, and its history. It was founded or created by a black American who 100 years ago in 1906 was made to sit at the back of the church because he was black, but he stood up and started speaking in tongues as the apostles did at the Pentecost. The Christian mythology has it that after Jesus had ascended to heaven, his 12 disciples were meeting, and they were visited by the Holy Spirit and started to speak in tongues or speak in languages they didn't understand, which enabled them to preach to the rest of the world. And when Pentecostalists pray hard enough, they reach a point of spiritual and linguistic ecstasy that they start speaking in tongues. And I will show you a section of the film in which that does happen.
But just you alone this morning, you have the power and you have the authority to keep to deliver and to set free this morning. We bring all your children around the world before you. God, every nations of the world this morning are crying out. We lift them up. Oh, we pray, Lord, for Jerusalem, shedding of blood all over the world this morning. But your time is at hand. Your time is coming. And every man will live on account of your Son's blood that he has shed for us upon the cross. So we are released. All that the Father has is he could have said, no, Father, I cannot take this joy. And yet he take our place and he died for us. And we want to take his place now. I said, Lord, so when he come. Oh, when he come, we'll be ready and getting ready when we'll be ready to go home with him. What he has done for us this morning. Oh God, he will lead us, but we lead us in. He will cause us to lead us in the love of the Lamb this morning. In the name of Jesus, by the blood of Jesus this morning, the blood of the King, the Prince of Peace, the great I am, we just need everything to you this morning. And ask you to take over this morning. Lord, this morning, I saw others, oh God, who might be tormented because of something else. Others, oh God, who might be so many years have passed. So many years have passed since you saved me. Lord, amidst all the ups and downs, I held on to you. Amidst some give me 6 weeks, some say I would not have made it, but hallelujah. Oh, hallelujah. Oh, for the right I say away, Christian, away with the lamb, you and blood and cry, away. Jesus is coming soon. Oh, Zion, away. For when the moon turned into blood and the son of man shall appear, help us to be away. Because you're faithful, God, and you're worthy. You're so worthy of our praise, my God. Redeeming the kindness for the days I saw you, my God, my Jehovah, my Father, my Father, my Father, my Father, my Father.
part of what's interesting to me about this is the idea that that God exists where logic does fail. So, but also in terms of as soon as words become meaningless, that's where most meaning lies. Also, the structure of the prayer, it's both collaboration and individual. I filmed a few different prayer meetings, and they last 2 hours long. You've seen more than half of the section of the film that records the prayer meetings, but they do have a musical structure, and there's a movement from beggings or asking to forgiveness, to sadness, to anger, and then transcendence and joy and ecstasy. And when I edited these 2-hour meetings down to 8 minutes, the musical structure became very apparent, and it began to remind me of jazz music, actually, and also, in specific, for example, Charles Mingus has a song, Wednesday Morning Prayer Meeting, and I began to realize that this is where that kind of both collaboration and improvisation comes from. It's also potentially revolutionary and politically exciting because of the apocalyptic aspect of the belief. Their idea of eschatology involves a radical social leveling, and always has since its inception. And you see clearly from the pictures that maybe 90% of the most faithful are women, single mothers and widowers. So it does have this inherent feminist aspect of it, and the single mothers and widowers are the most disenfranchised, but at the same time the social backbone of the urban poor. And so if we're going to talk about the potential of any revolution, they are the ones we should be addressing. And it brings me to my next point about the relationship between religion and feminism. In feminist philosophy, and particularly from the French feminists from the 70s, the kind of Lacanian or psychoanalytic philosophers such as Irigaray, Cixous, and definitely Lacanian Kristeva, there was this idea of trying to define female epistemology, or what a female epistemology might be. It is, of course, true that it's impossible to imagine any outside of ideology because we are always inside of it. But at the same time, they were trying through the feminine writing movement, or also through appreciation of past women, especially female mystics in the medieval time, who would have perhaps hysterical eruptions of ecstatic religious experience. I'm thinking of Marjorie Kemp, Saint Teresa, for example, where they would, in both a private but quite public revolutionary gesture, claim truth to be their own because they were speaking in the voice of God. It was along those lines that I made the film The Gates of Damascus, and I'll show you a clip of that. This film follows a Syrian housewife in Damascus who believes that she receives the stigmata wounds of Christ, and that Jesus comes to give her messages to give to her followers. Olive oil miraculously seeps from her skin, and these miracles all happen over Easter weekend. And so they follow the pattern of the Passion story. It starts on Holy Thursday and ends on Easter Sunday. And so it also very interesting. It demonstrates exactly Lucy Irigary's idea of double mimesis. That is when she reproduces previous, what she calls patriarchal philosophical texts in a debilitating way. She kind of, does it in this poetic, illogical way. I'm not sure that it's philosophy. It's actually still rather interesting. But she speaks from the position of the philosopher, but speaks in her feminine writing style. And I think the woman you're about to see does very much the same thing, although she's certainly not trying to undermine Christianity, but instead glorify it. She does betray its problems.
احنا عراقيين جينا من العراق رأسا حتى تسوينا تظهر لنا عجوبة قوة من الرب وشافنا هذه الطفلة الإيمان وقوة مساعدة قديسة منا. أنا قديسة أعتبر لأن على يد الشافون قد سووا شفاء من الزيت والدم والظهورات والمسيح. نطلب من عنده ساعدنا على شفاء طفلتنا. نشكر الله.
احنا جينا من اجل نسمع فيها بالعراق من 85 من 82 جتنا افلام علميه ونظريه فجينا تقصدنا على ود شفاء هاي الطفله تتشافى. اليوم وصلنا الساعه 5 احنا جينا راسا جينا بيت ميرنا نشوف ان شاء الله من اجل السلام من اجل السلام بالعراق. يعني إن شاء الله يا ربي سلام وصحة وعافية ونعيش. أنا سنة و3 أشهر ونص. اسمها نور. سنة و3 أشهر ونص. بس لا تمشي ولا تتحرك.
أنت Och atraktion خلاص هي atraktion ما خلاص atraktion يعني يبدأ يعني هو اوكي يسوع هون
Well, the movie I made doesn't doubt anywhere in the structure of the movie, or not, at least not obviously, that miracles are happening, and nor does anybody around her. It's a belief held by all of her family and friends, and all those people who come to visit her from as far away as Tahiti, honestly. It's not a recognized miracle by the Catholic or Orthodox Church. She comes from a mixed Catholic and Orthodox family. And I think this highlights the kind of position of women in the Catholic Church. The idolization of the Virgin Mary was popularly introduced by women within the Church and finally institutionalized over centuries of protest and resistance by women. And I think Myrna certainly fits squarely in this tradition. Something that I was trying to show with the film as well is that, in a certain sense, there is no difference between performance and authenticity. The film is both a documentary and a mythology. I mean, everything that happens, happened in fact. Whether or not it's a miracle is left for the viewer to decide. And I believe in that way she really does symbolize Jesus much more than either the Catholic or Orthodox churches would like to admit. That that miracles, as viewed by disbelievers, really aren't impressive, or can seem like easy charlatanism, but collectively there is this kind of agreement or among its participants that becomes so true and so real for them, and the same is true for the Pentecostalists. And I have to say, when I was filming either the Pentecostalists or Myrna, I had a hard time remaining distant, and often didn't remain distant, and believed it as well. It's such a powerful and moving experience. The other important point about the Iraqi woman and the baby who I imagine or believe probably has some sort of Gulf War syndrome. There is some supposition about that. Who Myrna uses as a prop almost, as this, she becomes the Madonna, and this child is the figure of Jesus at a certain, and she knows that she's performing this iconography, and she holds the baby like the Madonna does, and that's of course a composition that we shot and included, but she of course decided on as well, and this when she's in her bed with the child laying there, and all these people standing around her, adoring her like the shepherds adoring the manger, it's quite incredible that she's actually performing the myth, as it has been represented in paintings, and so there is this kind of dialectic as well. But most importantly is she is, and her miracle is necessitated by the emergency of the situation. I mean, these people depend on her, particularly the Iraqi grandmothers, but religious belief, I think the most important commonality between religious faith and faith in revolution is that it doesn't come from some sort of enlightened logic. It doesn't. It's not kind of necessitated out of philosophical discussion. It happens out of necessity of desperation, and it's provides, these miracles might provide a suture temporarily or emotionally for people in very difficult situations, but as I'll show in my next movie, it also provides absolutely necessary inspiration and consolation for risks taken in war. We saw with self-defense and Ibrahim that he's inspired by his belief to try to die, to defend Islam against the onslaughts of imperial capitalism in his view. The next film I'm going to show you is a situation that's ongoing, and it's in Nigeria. The situation with the oil companies is that it's the 7th largest oil fields in the world, and the people who live on top of the oil fields are desperately poor and are being actually starved by the oil production because the pollution from the oil facilities has killed all the fish in their swamplands and their fishing communities, so they're actually starving and dying and need to fight back. And it is their religion that defends them against the huge international corporate machinery that is oppressing them, and which is inspiring their resistance, which is actually quite brave, and I think that they have a chance.
So why can't we rip off our sweat? I am protected by the various Savannah spirits in the Niger Delta. I've got that. That's what I'm saying. This is a spirit, a guiding fence, a barrier between you and bullets, a barrier between you and ions, a barrier between you and anything that pierces or can tear the body, anything that can't bring a blood for the body. Basically, it's a spirit of it that not in, who touches your skin, because your skin is other than a rock. It will fall on me like this. It will eat me as a seed. And not as a seed. done. It's our bullet to follow me. It falls on me like a small sound. That's how it falls. So bullet is a mess. Because they are your friends. They live with you, you take you to them.
The militants swore to me that this was true, and I was with them long enough to trust them and believe them, and I hope for its sake for their sake that it is true that when they are in battle, bullets just drop from their skin. The question that I always have is, whether or not I believe in what in these stories I'm telling, and I think the primary question for us as artists is like, what do we need to believe in order to tell these stories? And I think that, first of all, I am primarily a storyteller, and that it's not my position to disseminate facts. And do I believe in them? Yes. Do I believe that they are facts? Not necessarily. I think I'm more interested in the disparity between fact and truth, and if we need to sacrifice facts to actualize truth, or to hold a truth that is more beautiful than the facts, or to believe, to create a revolutionary moment, then that is what we should do. It's not, I don't think it's the position of the artist to remain entirely and only critical from a logical or enlightened point of view. And I think what I'm trying to do is to find that ecstatic gap that I think is the gap of the imagination. And the gap between things as they appear to be and things as they are.